Good evening, and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. Tonight we're going to talk about a single moment in history that split a civilization in two, drew a line through the middle of ancient communities, and set nearly 1 billion people onto entirely different paths. It happened in 47 days, it was planned, rushed, misunderstood, and mourned, and its consequences are still being lived every single day by the descendants of those who survived it. Dim the lights, settle in, and let's begin. The subcontinent before the British. The story of partition does not begin in 1947. It does not even begin in the 19th century when the British tightened their grip on South Asia. To truly understand why the subcontinent was divided, why two nations emerged from one, and why the division carved wounds so deep they have not fully healed across 8 decades, we have to go back much further. We have to go back to the land itself, to the rivers and the plains and the mountains, and to the astonishing variety of peoples who made their lives between them. The Indian subcontinent is vast in a way that is genuinely difficult to comprehend from the outside. It stretches from the icy passes of the Himalayas in the north, where the air is thin and the peaks touch clouds, down through the great river plains of the Ganges and the Indus, through forests and plateaus and deserts, all the way to the warm tip of the southern peninsula, where the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, and the Arabian Sea meet. This is a piece of land larger than all of Western Europe, and for thousands of years it was home to one of the most complex and layered civilizations on Earth. By the time the first European ships began nosing their way toward the subcontinent in the late 1500s, India already had a history so long and intricate that entire libraries would struggle to contain it. Cities had risen and fallen in the Indus Valley more than 4,000 years before the British arrived. The Vedic traditions that shaped Hinduism, one of the oldest living religious traditions in the world, had been woven into the fabric of life across the northern plains. Buddhism had been born here, grown to a world religion, and in its original homeland been largely absorbed back into the vast ocean of Indian spiritual thought. Jainism had taken root. Islam had arrived not with armies at first, but with traders, drifting along the western coastline from as early as the 7th century of the Common Era, settling quietly into the coastal communities of what is now Kerala and Gujarat. The arrival of Islam as a political and military force came later, and when it came, it transformed the subcontinent in ways that still resonate today. The Ghaznavid raids in the 11th century, the Delhi Sultanate established in 1206, the successive waves of Turkic, Afghan and Central Asian rulers who moved through the mountain passes of the northwest, all of these reshaped northern India. They brought new languages, new architectural traditions, new systems of law and administration. Persian became the language of courts and culture across a vast swathe of the north. The cultural synthesis that emerged from centuries of Hindu and Muslim interaction produced art, music, poetry, and cuisine of extraordinary richness. The Urdu language itself was born from this encounter, a beautiful linguistic blend that carries both Sanskrit and Persian in its bones. And then came the Mughals. The Mughal Empire, founded by Babur in 1526 after the First Battle of Panipat, became one of the most powerful states in the world. At its height under Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, the Mughal Empire controlled vast swathes of the subcontinent. Its administration was sophisticated, its art was dazzling, its architecture gave the world the Taj Mahal. The empire was not, for much of its history, simply a Muslim state, imposing itself on a Hindu population. It was something more complex and more interesting than that. Akbar in particular pursued a policy of deliberate inclusion, marrying Rajput princesses, appointing Hindu generals and administrators, and even experimenting with a syncretic spiritual philosophy he called Dini Ilahi, a kind of attempt to draw the best of all religions into one. He was, it must be said, more successful as an emperor than as a theologian. The texture of life across the subcontinent in the 16th, 17th and early 18th centuries was enormously varied. In the south, great Hindu kingdoms like the Vijayanagara Empire had flourished and then fragmented. Along the coasts, the Portuguese had already established footholds, followed by the Dutch and then the English. The Maratha Confederacy rose in the Western Deccan as a formidable Hindu political and military power that would ultimately challenge Mughal authority across enormous stretches of the subcontinent. The Sikh faith, born in the Punjab in the 15th century from the teachings of Guru Nanak, grew into a distinct religious community with its own sacred scripture, its own traditions, and over time its own formidable military capacity. What's crucial to understand about all of this is not that the subcontinent was a paradise of perfect harmony, where everyone loved their neighbour regardless of religion or caste or language. It was not. There were conflicts between Hindu and Muslim communities. There were caste hierarchies of crushing brutality. There were wars between kingdoms that followed different faiths. Human beings being human beings, there was also ordinary prejudice and fear. But what is equally true is that for most ordinary people in most ordinary places across most of Indian history, daily life was lived in close proximity across religious lines. Hindu and Muslim farmers shared village wells. Craftsmen of different faiths worked side by side. Sufi shrines attracted devotees of many traditions. Festivals were often observed and celebrated by communities that nominally belonged to different religions. The subcontinent was not one thing. It was many things, layered and intermixed and impossibly complicated. This complexity is what makes the story of partition so difficult and so important to get right. Because what happened in 1947 was not the inevitable expression of ancient hatreds between two irreconcilable peoples. That is a convenient story, but it is not the full story. What happened was the result of specific decisions made by specific people in specific circumstances, shaped by colonial policies, political pressures, personal ambitions, and the machinery of an empire that was collapsing faster than anyone fully understood. By the early 18th century, the Mughal Empire itself was fracturing. The later Mughals, beginning with Aurangzeb's increasingly rigid religious policies and his endless military campaigns in the Deccan, had strained the empire's resources and alienated communities that had previously been loyal. After Aurangzeb died in 1707, the succession wars that followed weakened the central authority dramatically. Regional governors, known as Nawabs, became effectively independent. The Marathas expanded. The Rajput kingdoms asserted themselves. Persia's Nadir Shah sacked Delhi in 1739 and carried away the famous Peacock Throne. The Afghans under Ahmad Shah Durrani defeated the Marathas at the Third Battle of Panipat in 1761, a battle so catastrophic that it broke Maratha power in the north for a generation. Into this landscape of fragmentation and shifting power, a new force was moving steadily inland from the coasts. The British East India Company had arrived, and the world would never be quite the same again. The East India Company and the Slow Conquest. The East India Company is one of the stranger entities in the history of human civilization. It was a commercial enterprise with its own army, a trading company that ended up ruling a subcontinent. If you described it to someone who had never heard of it, they would assume you were making it up. You are not. The company received its royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I in 1600, established initially to compete with the Dutch in the spice trade of Southeast Asia. It was not, at the start, particularly interested in India as a territory to govern. It was interested in profit. Trading posts were established along the Indian coastline, in Surat, in Madras, in Bombay, in Calcutta, small enclaves where English merchants conducted business under the sufferance of local rulers. These were not colonies in the full sense. They were commercial outposts, permitted to exist because they brought revenue and trade goods that local rulers found useful. This relatively modest commercial arrangement began to change in the 18th century, as the Mughal Empire disintegrated, and the power vacuum created by that disintegration opened new possibilities for anyone with enough money, guns, and audacity to exploit them. The East India Company had all three. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 is often cited as the turning point. Robert Clive, commanding company forces against the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, won through a combination of military action and a spectacular betrayal arranged beforehand with Mir Jafar, one of the Nawab's own generals. It was less a battle than a transaction in which a kingdom changed hands. After Plassey, the company effectively controlled Bengal, the richest province of the subcontinent, and here is where things get particularly interesting and particularly grim. The company's rule over Bengal brought a level of economic extraction that was breathtaking in its intensity. Tax collection was handed to company servants who had every incentive to squeeze as much as possible from the population. The result was devastating. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770 killed an estimated 10 million people, roughly 1/3 of Bengal's population at the time. The company continued to collect revenues throughout the famine. If there were a hall of fame for catastrophically bad governance, this would have a prominent exhibit. Through the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the company expanded its control through a mixture of outright military conquest, diplomatic manipulation, and legal sleight of hand. The subsidiary alliance system, perfected under Governor-General Wellesley, worked as follows. Indian rulers would accept British military protection, agree to maintain no independent foreign relations, and pay for the cost of the company troops stationed within their territories. If they fell behind on payments, which was more or less inevitable given the financial terms, the company would seize territory to cover the debt. It was protection money dressed up in bureaucratic language, and it worked beautifully for the company. The Mysore Wars brought the defeat and death of Tipu Sultan, one of the most capable Indian rulers of the era, in 1799. The Maratha Confederacy, the most significant remaining indigenous power in the subcontinent, was finally broken through a series of wars ending in 1818. The Sindh was annexed in 1843. The Punjab, the last major independent state, was absorbed after two fierce Sikh wars, with the Treaty of Lahore in 1849 formally ending Sikh sovereignty and bringing the great kingdom of Ranjit Singh under British control. By the middle of the 19th century, there was effectively no significant part of the subcontinent that lay outside British reach. But the company's rule was not simply conquest. It was also transformation, and transformation of a particularly complicated kind. On one hand, the British built infrastructure. Canals were dug, railways began to be laid, telegraph lines connected distant cities, and a centralized legal and administrative system created a kind of unified governance that the subcontinent had not always possessed. These were real achievements, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. On the other hand, the economic logic of the entire enterprise was extraction. India produced cotton, indigo, jute, tea, and opium, all of which travelled to British markets. Indian artisans, most famously the cotton weavers of Bengal and Dhaka, who had produced muslin so fine that Mughal emperors had draped it over their bodies, found their livelihoods destroyed as cheap British machine-made cloth flooded the market. The impact on agriculture was equally severe. As more and more land was converted to commercial crops for export, food production for local consumption suffered. The result was a string of famines across the 19th century, not quite as catastrophic as 1770, but devastating nonetheless. The British response to these famines was shaped by a very particular economic ideology. Free trade principles held that providing relief to famine victims would distort markets and create dependency. The Viceroy Lord Lytton reportedly sent grain exports out of India during the Madras famine of 1876 to 1879 while millions starved. Economic historians like Mike Davis have written powerfully about these events. The word criminal is not, in this context, excessive. Alongside economic transformation came cultural and religious intervention that created deep anxieties within Indian society. Evangelical Christianity had gained significant influence within the company's administration by the early 19th century. Governor-General Bentinck banned the practice of sati, the immolation of Hindu widows, in 1829. This was, in purely human terms, a good thing. The abolition of a practice that killed women is worth defending regardless of who did it, but it was accompanied by broader attitudes of cultural superiority. The belief that India was a civilization in need of saving, and that the British were best positioned to do the saving. Macaulay's famous Minute on Education in 1835 argued for a system designed to create a class of people Indian in blood and colour, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. This was not simply education policy. It was a programme of cultural replacement. These tensions accumulated over decades, pressing down on a population that had no real political voice, no way to express grievance except through petition, or eventually revolt. The revolt, when it came, was explosive. The Revolt of 1857 and its aftermath. The Revolt of 1857 is one of those historical events that refuses to sit still inside a single definition. Every time you think you have it pinned down, another angle opens up and the picture shifts. The British called it the Indian Mutiny, emphasizing its origins among the sepoys, the Indian soldiers in the company's army, and framing it as a breakdown of military discipline rather than a genuine political uprising. Indian nationalists later called it the First War of Independence, emphasizing its geographic spread, its popular character, and its meaning as a conscious rejection of foreign rule. Both names carry truth. Both names carry agenda. The reality, as with most historical events of this complexity, sits somewhere between the labels and contains more than either can fully hold, which is a polite way of saying that anyone who tells you it was simply one thing, or simply the other, is probably selling you something. The immediate trigger was, of all things, a cartridge. The new Enfield rifles being issued to sepoys in the company's Bengal army required soldiers to bite the tips of paper cartridges before loading them. Rumours spread with the speed that rumours have always travelled in close-quartered military life that the grease used to lubricate these cartridges was made from the fat of cows and pigs. For Hindu soldiers, the cow was sacred, and contact with beef was a profound and serious religious transgression, not a minor inconvenience, but a violation of something central to their spiritual identity. For Muslim soldiers, the pig was haram, forbidden by religious law. The rumour may or may not have been accurate. Some historians argue it was based on a genuine manufacturing decision. Others suggest it was exaggerated in the retelling. What is not in doubt is the landscape into which it fell. That landscape was already saturated with grievances. There were anxieties, some imagined and some entirely justified, about forced Christianization, a sense among sections of the sepoy population that the company intended eventually to convert its Indian employees to Christianity. There was deep resentment of racial hierarchies that placed Indian soldiers below their British officers in pay, in promotion prospects, and in the simple daily calculus of who was treated with respect and who was not. There was anger over the annexation of Awadh in 1856, a decision that had stripped the court of Lucknow of its sovereignty and thrown thousands of people, not only nobles but servants, craftsmen, musicians, soldiers, and tradespeople whose livelihoods depended on the court, into poverty and displacement. The cartridge rumour did not cause the revolt. It ignited a landscape that had been accumulating combustible material for years. When sepoys at Meerut refused to use the cartridges in May of 1857 and were publicly punished for their refusal, stripped of their uniforms and shackled, their comrades did not accept this quietly. They broke open the jail, freed the imprisoned soldiers, killed British officers, and marched to Delhi with a purpose that went well beyond regimental grievance. They placed themselves under the authority of the elderly Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar, a poet king in his 80s who had very little real power but possessed enormous symbolic weight as the last representative of the dynasty that had ruled northern India for 3 centuries. The choice of Zafar as figurehead was a political act of considerable sophistication. It declared that this was not merely a military mutiny, but a challenge to the legitimacy of British rule itself, reaching back to an older order that the company had displaced. The rebellion spread across a wide swathe of northern and central India with a speed that genuinely alarmed the British administration. Lucknow fell, its residency placed under siege in circumstances that would later be mythologized endlessly in British imperial literature. Kanpur saw a massacre of British civilians that, whatever the full complexity of its circumstances, would be invoked for decades afterward as justification for British racial contempt and collective punishment. Throughout the rebellion, commanders of extraordinary capability emerged from the chaos. Lakshmi Bai, the Rani of Jhansi, whose state had been annexed by the company under the doctrine of lapse after her husband died without a biological heir, fought with remarkable skill and courage, and became one of the most celebrated figures in the entire history of Indian resistance. She died in battle in June of 1858, aged somewhere in her mid-20s. She remains one of the most powerful symbols in Indian nationalist memory, and justifiably so. The British response to the revolt was ferocious in a way that leaves little room for diplomatic softening in the telling. Villages were burned. Suspected rebels were executed without trial, and often with deliberate theatrical cruelty designed to communicate a message about the consequences of resistance. When Delhi was recaptured in September of 1857 after a brutal siege that had lasted through the murderous heat of an Indian summer, the reprisals visited on the city were savage, the looting systematic, and the killing extensive. Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, that fragile and elderly figure who had been handed a revolution he had neither planned nor fully wanted, was tried and found guilty of treason and rebellion. He was exiled to Rangoon in Burma, where he died in 1862, composing poetry until the very end in a voice of extraordinary sorrow and dignity. His tomb is in Rangoon, not in Delhi, not in Agra, not anywhere in the land his dynasty had ruled. The dynasty that Babur had founded at Panipat in 1526 ended in a bare room in exile with a very old man, his verses, and his grief. The defeat of the revolt had consequences that reached with remarkable directness into the circumstances of 1947. The East India Company, that extraordinary commercial entity that had somehow ended up governing a subcontinent, was abolished. The British Crown took direct control of India in 1858, and Queen Victoria became Empress of India in 1877, a title possessed of a certain magnificence that somewhat obscured the processes by which it had been acquired. The new system of Crown governance brought a more formal, more entrenched, and in many ways more ideologically self-conscious colonial state. The viceroy sat at the head of an enormous administrative apparatus that stretched down through commissioners and collectors and district officers all the way to the village level, a structure of governance that touched the lives of hundreds of millions of people in ways that previous forms of rule in the subcontinent had not. The British response to the revolt also hardened certain attitudes in ways that had profound and lasting consequences for everything that followed, including partition itself. The belief that the rebellion had been in part the product of insufficient attention to the divisions between Hindus and Muslims produced, or perhaps more accurately justified, a set of policies that historians have debated for generations under the heading of divide and rule. Whether the British deliberately manufactured religious divisions or simply found existing community tensions politically useful and chose to amplify rather than diminish them is a question that does not admit a clean answer. Both things were probably true at different times and in different places and in the minds of different administrators. What is considerably less debatable is the pattern that emerged from decades of colonial governance, a consistent tendency to emphasize religious identity as the primary political category, to count people not simply as Indian subjects, but as Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs, to draw administrative boundaries with communal demographics in mind, and eventually to create separate electorates through which members of each religious community could vote only for candidates from their own group. This political architecture took decades to construct, and the British constructed it deliberately whether or not they fully understood what they were building. By the time anyone thought seriously about dismantling it, it had become load-bearing. You could not remove it without the building falling. Post-1857 India was also, and this matters enormously for the story we are telling, a place of genuine social and intellectual ferment that the colonial encounter had itself helped produce. The generation of Indians educated in the English language schools and universities that the colonial system had built found themselves equipped with an education they had not chosen in a language that was not their own, but they had read the texts of the Western liberal tradition with attention and intelligence, and they had noticed something the colonial administrators perhaps had not fully anticipated. The ideas in those texts about liberty and rights and self-determination, and the illegitimacy of governance without consent, applied rather directly to their own situation. Why, they began to ask, should these principles apply only to Europeans? It was a logical question, it was an inconvenient question. It was, within the framework of liberal thought, ultimately unanswerable, which is precisely why the British found it so persistently and so understandably irritating. The education system built to produce loyal colonial subjects had produced instead a generation of people who had read Locke and Mill, and were now asking why Locke and Mill applied in England but not in India. This is the kind of outcome that happens when you give people tools and then expect them not to use the tools. From that generation of questioners would come the Indian National Congress, the independence movement, Gandhi, Jinnah, Nehru, and eventually the events of 1947. The revolt of 1857 did not cause partition, but it reshaped the colonial state in ways that made partition more likely, and it produced a response that planted seeds in the soil of Indian politics that would grow into something the planters had never imagined and would not, in the end, be able to control. The birth of Indian nationalism. If you want to identify a single year when organised Indian nationalism was born, you could make a reasonable case for 1885. That was the year the Indian National Congress held its first session in Bombay. But that would be a little like identifying the birth of a river, with the moment it first reaches the sea. The currents that fed into the Congress had been building for decades. The generation of Indians educated in English language schools and universities in the mid-19th century found themselves in a peculiar position. They had absorbed the texts of the Western liberal tradition, Locke and Mill and Burke and the ideas of the French Revolution, and they had found in those texts arguments that could be turned, with some adjustment, against the system that had given them that education. They also found, as they examined their own traditions with new tools, a renewal of pride in the depth and antiquity of Indian civilization. The Bengal Renaissance of the early 19th century, associated with figures like Ram Mohan Roy, blended this double impulse, reform from within, assertion from without. The Indian National Congress, when it was founded in 1885 by a retired British civil servant named Alan Octavian Hume, was not initially a radical organisation. The early Congress was populated by lawyers, journalists, professors, and professionals who came together once a year to draft polite resolutions asking for modest reforms, more representation in the civil service, Some say in the legislative councils, fair treatment before the law. The style was deferential, the demands were moderate, and the British generally found them manageable. There is something almost touching about this early period. A group of deeply intelligent men writing extremely courteous petitions to an empire that was taking their country and asking, with great respect, if perhaps things might be slightly improved. But the Congress grew, and it grew in part because the British kept providing fresh grievances. The Partition of Bengal in 1905 by Viceroy Curzon was one of these. Curzon divided Bengal on the grounds of administrative efficiency. Bengal was a large province, and he argued difficult to govern as a single unit. This was true, but the particular division he chose split Bengal along lines that separated the Muslim majority east from the Hindu majority west. To many nationalists, this looked less like administrative reform and more like a deliberate attempt to divide a politically active province whose lawyers and journalists had been the most consistent and articulate critics of British rule. The response was the Swadeshi movement, meaning of one's own country. Indians boycotted British goods, particularly cloth, and burned foreign textiles in public bonfires. Swadeshi fairs sold domestic products. The Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore, who would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1913, and who remains one of the most luminous figures in the intellectual history of the subcontinent, composed songs and poems that became anthems of resistance. He would later return his knighthood in protest after the Amritsar massacre of 1919, a gesture of extraordinary moral clarity. The Partition of Bengal was reversed in 1911, a victory for nationalist pressure, but in the same year the colonial capital was moved from Calcutta to Delhi, a shift heavy with symbolism. Delhi had been the seat of Mughal power. By moving the capital there, the British were asserting their own claim to the tradition of imperial rule over the subcontinent. There is a person missing from the story so far, and his absence is intentional because his entrance deserves its own space. In 1915, a lawyer who had spent the previous 21 years in South Africa, fighting for the rights of the Indian community there, returned to the subcontinent. He was thin, bespectacled, dressed in simple clothing, and entirely unlike any political figure India had seen before. His name was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, and though he is sometimes reduced to a kind of saintly abstraction by the way his story is told, he was in fact one of the most remarkable and complicated political operatives of the 20th century. A man of genuine spiritual depth who was also a strategic genius. These things are not mutually exclusive, though it can surprise people to discover them combined. The All India Muslim League, founded in 1906, is the other critical institution to understand. It was established in Dhaka in the year following the Partition of Bengal, partly in response to a feeling among some Muslim leaders that the Congress, despite claiming to represent all Indians, was in practice dominated by Hindu professionals and did not adequately represent Muslim interests. The League in its early years was not a separatist organisation. It supported the idea of Indian self-government and worked alongside the Congress at various points. But it was building its own organisational infrastructure, its own sense of a distinct Muslim political identity, and its own interpretation of what the future of India should look like. The man who would eventually make that interpretation the basis of a new nation was, at this stage, actually a member of the Congress. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, born in Karachi in 1876, was a brilliantly talented lawyer, sharply dressed, elegantly spoken, and committed in his early career to the vision of a united, self-governing India in which Hindus and Muslims would share power under a secular constitutional framework. Jinnah was, in these years, celebrated by none other than Sarojini Naidu, the poet and nationalist, as the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. It is one of history's more ironic titles, given what was to come, but it was a genuine description of who he was and what he believed in the 1910s and early 20s. Gandhi, non-cooperation, and the mass movement Gandhi's genius was to take the Indian independence movement and make it something that previously it had not been, a mass movement. The Congress before Gandhi was a lawyers' organisation, educated, articulate, effective in its way, but speaking primarily to and for an urban elite. Gandhi broke that open. He travelled across India, literally and deliberately, and he listened. He understood that the grievances of the peasant farmer, the mill worker, the untouchable, were the grievances that needed to be at the centre of the national movement, and he found a method that was both deeply Indian in its spiritual roots and extraordinarily sophisticated as a political strategy. Non-violent resistance, satyagraha, which he translated roughly as truth force or soul force. The method worked on multiple levels simultaneously. It was morally powerful, placing the burden of visible violence on the oppressor and making every act of British force into an advertisement for the justice of the Indian cause. It was practically ingenious, because it organised millions of people who had no guns and no military training into an effective political force. And it was, for Gandhi, not merely a strategy, but an expression of a deeply held belief that means and ends could not be separated, that a free India won through violence would not be truly free. The Rowlatt Act of 1919 was Gandhi's first major target. Passed by the colonial government, it allowed the detention of political suspects without trial. The act was, put simply, a mechanism for arresting people who disagreed with colonial rule and keeping them locked up without having to prove anything. Gandhi called for a national strike hartal in protest. The response was extraordinary. Cities across India shut down, the British were rattled, and then came Amritsar. On April 13th, 1919, a large crowd gathered at Jallianwala Bagh, a walled garden in the city of Amritsar in the Punjab. Many were pilgrims who had come for the Sikh festival of Baisakhi. The gathering had been banned, but many in the crowd did not know this. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to open fire without warning and without ordering the crowd to disperse. There was only one narrow exit. People were shot trying to reach it. When the firing stopped after roughly 10 minutes and 1,700 rounds, somewhere between 379 and over 1,000 people were dead, depending on which account you trust. The colonial government initially covered up the scale of the massacre. Dyer was later asked whether he would have continued firing if he had more ammunition. He indicated he would. He was censured by some in the British government and celebrated by others. A collection was taken for him in Britain. He received over £26,000. The Amritsar massacre transformed Indian politics. For Jinnah, who had been working within constitutional frameworks and who believed in the possibility of negotiated partnership with the British, it was a moment of profound moral shock. He would later describe it as the turning point of his political career. For Gandhi, it deepened the conviction that the colonial system could not be reformed from within. It had to go. For millions of ordinary Indians who heard about the massacre through the press and through word of mouth, it made the abstract case for self-rule into something concrete and personal. The non-cooperation movement of 1921 brought India to a kind of standstill it had never quite seen before. Indians were asked to return honours and titles given by the British. Lawyers were asked to boycott courts. Students were asked to leave government schools. People were asked to boycott British goods and spin their own cloth, khadi. The sight of Gandhi at a spinning wheel was not accidental symbolism. It was a precise political message. The cotton the British took from India and turned into cloth in Lancashire mills and sold back at a profit, we can make ourselves. Every thread spun on every charkha was a small act of economic defiance. The movement was suspended by Gandhi in 1922 after violence broke out at Chauri Chaura in Uttar Pradesh, where a mob set fire to a police station, killing 22 officers. Gandhi's decision to call off a mass movement that was gaining extraordinary momentum because a single incident of violence occurred contradicted what many of his colleagues felt was rational political strategy. It generated real fury within the Congress. But for Gandhi, the logic was absolute. A movement built on the principle of non-violence that produced violence was a movement that had contradicted its own foundations. He would not continue under those conditions. Whether you find this deeply principled or strategically maddening probably depends on your temperament. Many people found it both simultaneously. Through the 1920s, Indian politics became increasingly complicated by the question that had been gathering force since the founding of the Muslim League. The question of representation, of communal identity, of what political structures in a self-governing India would look like and what protections different communities would have within them. Separate electorates, which the British had introduced, created a system in which Hindu voters elected Hindu representatives and Muslim voters elected Muslim representatives. The rationale was to protect minority communities from being swamped by majority votes. The effect was to enshrine religious community as the primary unit of political identity, and to make competition between communities a structural feature of the political system. You built a system in which your religious identity determined who you could vote for, and then you were surprised that religious identity became politically salient. Remarkable. The Congress continued to maintain that it was a secular organisation representing all Indians regardless of religion. But the Muslim League, and increasingly sections of Muslim political opinion argued that the Congress was in practice a Hindu organisation, and that Muslim interests within it were secondary. This argument had some truth to it. The Congress leadership, with some significant exceptions, was predominantly Hindu. Its organisational culture reflected Hindu norms more than it perhaps acknowledged. Gandhi himself, for all his genuine commitment to religious pluralism, expressed his politics in deeply Hindu idioms that some of his Muslim contemporaries found exclusionary, even when they respected him personally. The 1928 Nehru Report, a constitutional proposal drafted by a Congress committee under Motilal Nehru, offered a vision of a united, self-governing India with specific protections for minorities. Jinnah, still operating within the Congress at this point, offered modifications to address Muslim League concerns, particularly around proportional representation and residual powers for provinces. The modifications were rejected by the Congress majority. This rejection has been identified by many historians as a crucial moment in Jinnah's political evolution, the point at which he began to conclude that Muslim interests could not be adequately protected within a Congress-dominated framework. Whether this conclusion was correct, and whether a more accommodating response from the Congress might have changed the trajectory of events, is one of the most actively debated questions in the historiography of partition. Jinnah, the Muslim League, and the two-nation theory Muhammad Ali Jinnah is one of the most debated figures in modern history, and the debate often reveals more about the debater than about the man. In Pakistan, he is the revered founder, Quaid-e-Azam, the great leader, the man who created a nation for Muslims in a subcontinent where they would otherwise have been a permanent minority. In India, he is often cast as the villain of partition, the man whose intransigence broke the country. In Western scholarship, he tends to be described as a brilliant but enigmatic figure whose motivations remain genuinely difficult to pin down. Here is what seems reasonably clear. Jinnah was not, by upbringing or inclination, a religious man. He ate pork on occasion, he drank whiskey, he dressed in Savile Row suits, he spoke better English than Urdu and better Urdu than Sindhi, his native language. He had a great love for the theatre, particularly Shakespeare. He married a Parsi woman from a prominent Bombay family, Ratan Bai, known as Rutti, who was 16 when they married and who died at 29 in circumstances that devastated him. He was, in his personal life and habits, very far from the picture of an Islamic religious leader, and yet he became the architect of a state created explicitly in the name of Muslim identity. The gap between the man and the mission he led is one of the more fascinating puzzles in 20th century political history. The Lahore Resolution of 1940, known in Pakistan as the Pakistan Resolution, was the formal declaration by the Muslim League that Muslims constituted a separate nation within the subcontinent and that they required independent states in regions where they formed the majority. Note that the resolution initially spoke of states, plural. The word Pakistan was not actually used in the resolution, though it had been circulating as a concept since 1933, when a Cambridge student named Chaudhry Rahmat Ali coined it from the initial letters of Punjab, Afghanistan, meaning the northwest frontier, Kashmir and Sindh, with the tan from Baluchistan at the end. The name also means land of the pure in Urdu, which was either a convenient coincidence or a deliberate design. It was likely the latter. The two-nation theory, which the Muslim League formally adopted as its political doctrine, held that Hindus and Muslims were not simply two religious communities within one nation. They were two distinct nations with different histories, different cultures, different heroes and different destinies. This was, as a theory, a significant step. It meant that a united democratic India governed by majority vote would permanently leave Muslims as a minority subject to Hindu domination. The only solution, the argument went, was a separate homeland. Now the Congress, and Gandhi in particular, absolutely rejected this framing. The Congress argued that religion could not be the basis of nationhood, that the concept of one nation could encompass enormous religious diversity, that the real divisions in Indian society were economic and social rather than religious, and that separate nations on the basis of religion would not solve the problem of minority communities in either state, but would simply create new majorities and new minorities. These were serious arguments. The problem, from the Muslim League's perspective, was that the Congress's track record in provinces where it had governed suggested that rhetoric about inclusive secular nationalism did not always translate into practice when it came to Muslim representation in government. The provincial elections of 1937 were a pivotal moment. Under the Government of India Act of 1935, considerable self-governing powers were devolved to the provinces. The Congress won enormous victories across most of the subcontinent, gaining control of 8 of 11 provinces. The Muslim League performed poorly, winning only a small fraction of the Muslim seats it contested. One might argue that this demonstrated the League's limited support base, and thus the weakness of the two-nation theory. Jinnah drew precisely the opposite conclusion. The elections showed him that the Congress, flush with electoral success, had no real need to accommodate the League, and that the League needed to dramatically expand its organisational reach and popular appeal among Muslim communities. The Congress's behaviour in office after the 1937 elections provided ammunition for the League's arguments. There were real and documented instances of Congress provincial governments acting in ways that made Muslim minority communities uncomfortable. Hindi was promoted in some provinces in ways that disadvantaged Urdu speakers. Cow slaughter protections were enacted that reflected Hindu sensibility. The practice of singing the nationalist song Vande Mataram, which contains imagery uncomfortable to many Muslims from its origins in Bengali literature, was promoted in schools. These were not atrocities, but they were signals, and Jinnah read them carefully and deployed them effectively. By the early 1940s, the Muslim League had transformed itself. What had been a relatively elite organisation of Muslim professionals and landed gentry became, through intense organisational work, a genuine mass movement. The simple, powerful message that Muslims needed their own home resonated with communities across the subcontinent who had genuine anxieties about their future in a Hindu-majority independent India. By the 1945-46 elections, the Muslim League had swept virtually every Muslim constituency. This was not merely a political victory, it was a mandate, or at least Jinnah and the League interpreted it as one. The question of whether that mandate was specifically for Pakistan as a separate nation, or simply for the League as the representative of Muslim political interest within negotiations, is another fiercely contested point. But the electoral arithmetic of 1945-46 made it very difficult for the Congress to argue that Jinnah did not speak for the Muslim community. The Second World War and India's crossroads. The Second World War arrived in India in September of 1939, the way a great many things arrived in India under British rule, without anyone asking. The Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, announced that India was at war with Germany. He made this announcement without consulting a single Indian leader, without seeking the opinion of the provincial governments that Indian politicians had been running for 2 years, without so much as a courtesy conversation with the people whose country would be expected to supply soldiers, money, and resources for the duration of the conflict. He was, it should be said, legally entitled to do this. India was a crown possession, and the crown had declared war, and that was, under the constitutional arrangements then in force, entirely sufficient. But legality and wisdom are different things, and the political consequences of this particular announcement were significant and, one would think, somewhat foreseeable. If anyone in the colonial administration had paused to think about it for more than a few minutes, which apparently nobody had quite bothered to do, the Indian National Congress was incensed. And the incensement was not merely wounded pride at the lack of consultation, though that wound was real enough. It was something more fundamental. The Congress had been asked, implicitly and soon explicitly, to support a war being fought in the name of democracy and freedom and the rights of nations to determine their own futures, while the nation in which they lived was denied all of these things as a matter of deliberate policy. The argument for Indian participation, as the British framed it, was that freedom was worth fighting for. The Congress agreed completely. They simply observed that this argument applied rather directly to India itself, and that fighting to defend someone else's freedom while your own was withheld required a level of philosophical flexibility they were not prepared to perform. The Congress withdrew its ministers from the provincial governments it had been running since the 1937 elections. This decision is sometimes glossed over in histories of the period, but it deserves a moment of genuine attention because it was a significant and costly sacrifice. Running those governments had given the Congress something invaluable: real experience of administration, real influence over the practical lives of millions of people, real credibility as a governing force rather than merely an opposition movement. The provincial ministries were not nothing. They were the most substantial exercise of Indian political power that had existed up to that point. Walking away from them was a genuine political cost, and the Congress knew it, but the calculation was clear. Collaboration with the British war effort without any firm commitment on the question of independence was a transaction that cost Indian dignity and Indian lives, and produced nothing durable in return. The clarity of principled opposition, however expensive, was worth more than the murkiness of conditional cooperation. Jinnah and the Muslim League made a different calculation, and it was from the perspective of the League's interests an extremely shrewd one. They largely cooperated with the war effort. In exchange, they received from the British something of enormous political value, a commitment that no constitutional settlement for India would be imposed without the League's agreement. Read that again slowly, because its implications are vast. The British had effectively given Jinnah a veto over India's constitutional future. Whatever the Congress and the British might agree between themselves, whatever plan might be devised for the transfer of power, it could not go forward without the Muslim League signing off. For a party whose electoral performance in 1937 had been relatively modest, and whose claim to speak for all Indian Muslims was still contested, this was a position of extraordinary leverage. Jinnah understood exactly what he had been given, and he used it with considerable skill. The Congress's own response to the war years evolved in directions that went considerably beyond the withdrawal of provincial ministers. Gandhi had been watching developments with growing impatience and moral clarity. The spectacle of an empire demanding sacrifice in the name of freedom, while maintaining its own denial of that freedom, had become, for him, simply intolerable. In August of 1942, he launched the Quit India movement, and the message was as direct and uncompromising as anything Gandhi had ever put before the British administration. Leave India. Now. Not after the war was won. Not after some future constitutional conference had produced some future framework for some future transfer of power. Now. The demand was total, the timeline was immediate, and the British response was swift in a way that suggested they had been preparing for exactly this. Within 24 hours of the Congress passing the Quit India resolution, the entire Congress leadership had been arrested. Gandhi was imprisoned in the Aga Khan Palace in Pune, a gilded cage if ever there was one, though it would become associated with great personal sorrow. His long-serving secretary Mahadev Desai, who had been by Gandhi's side for decades, and who was in many ways the operational engine of everything Gandhi did, died within days of the imprisonment, from what appears to have been a heart attack brought on by the shock and strain. Gandhi's wife Kasturba, who had endured decades of political life, imprisonment, and the particular challenges of being married to a man who treated his political convictions as superior in every case to domestic comfort, died in February of 1944 in that same palace. Gandhi had been her husband for 62 years. He held her as she died. Nehru spent much of the war years in prison as well, which he used characteristically to write. The Congress as an organisation, its leadership locked away, was effectively removed from active politics for the duration of the conflict. But the Quit India movement did not simply end when the leadership was arrested. It exploded across the country in forms that Gandhi had not planned and would not have sanctioned, because they departed from the principle of non-violence that was for him not merely a strategy, but a moral absolute. Government buildings were attacked across multiple provinces. Telegraph lines were cut, disrupting communications that the administration depended on. Railways were sabotaged. In some areas, British authority temporarily collapsed so completely that local administrations ceased to function for weeks at a time. The British suppressed the uprising with considerable force, the kind of force that tends not to receive the same historical attention as the uprisings it suppresses. Thousands of people were killed. Hundreds of thousands were arrested and imprisoned. The movement failed in its immediate objective. The British did not leave India in 1942, but it demonstrated something that the British administration registered with considerable anxiety. The cost of maintaining control over India was rising, and it would continue to rise. It was also, in purely organisational terms, a remarkable display of the Congress's capacity to mobilise ordinary Indians across vast distances without central direction, since the central direction was in prison. That capacity frightened people who needed to be frightened. While all of this was unfolding in the political sphere, the war was producing a catastrophe in Bengal that has never received the attention it deserves in most standard accounts of the period, which tend to discuss Indian history of this era, primarily in terms of the independence movement and its leading figures. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed somewhere between 2 and 3 million people, with some estimates placing the toll considerably higher. It was not, as famines are sometimes assumed to be, simply a natural disaster produced by crop failure, though there was indeed some agricultural shortfall. It was produced by a complex and deeply human combination of factors, each of which reflected specific decisions made by specific people. Wartime inflation had driven food prices to levels that the rural poor simply could not afford to pay, meaning that food existed but could not be bought by the people who were dying for lack of it. British policy decisions, specifically the denial policy enacted to prevent Japanese forces from using local resources in the event of an invasion, had involved the deliberate destruction of boats and the confiscation and destruction of rice stocks in coastal areas. Rice was being exported from Bengal even as the famine killed. Merchants speculated on grain prices as people starved, because the market was functioning as markets function when they are unregulated in crisis conditions. And the colonial administration's response was slow, inadequate, and shaped by an ideological commitment to free market principles that prioritized the theoretical distortions of relief over the actual deaths of millions of people. Winston Churchill has been specifically and persistently blamed for decisions that significantly worsened the famine. He rejected requests for emergency food shipments to Bengal from other parts of the empire. He made remarks about Indians, including remarks about Gandhi specifically, whose content was deeply contemptuous and whose spirit was entirely consistent with a view of Indian lives as categorically less important than British ones. Churchill was, as anyone who has spent time with the historical record knows, many things simultaneously. A man of genuine courage and rhetorical brilliance, who helped prevent a Nazi victory in Europe, and whose contribution to that effort was real and significant, and also a man whose attitudes toward the peoples of the British Empire, and toward Indians in particular, were those of someone who did not regard those peoples as fully human in the way that Europeans were fully human. These two things coexisted in him without apparent discomfort on his part. The Bengal famine sits alongside the Amritsar massacre as one of the most damning indictments of what British rule in India actually meant in practice. As opposed to what it claimed to mean in its self-congratulatory official literature, it deserves to be remembered alongside the better-known tragedies of the partition story, because it is part of the same story. The war ended in August of 1945, Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and with the end of the war, the question that had been deferred, managed, argued about and deliberately postponed for decades suddenly became unavoidable with a force that admitted no further delay. The British had to leave India. The empire was exhausted and broke. The Labour government that swept Churchill from power in July of 1945 was genuinely committed to independence in a way that the Conservatives had generally not been. Indian soldiers who had fought in Burma and North Africa and Italy had returned home with a somewhat altered view of what they were and were not obliged to accept. The independence movement was more organised, more experienced, and more determined than it had ever been. The British had to leave India. The only question remaining, and it was an immense and consequential question, was when they would leave and what they would leave behind when they went. The cabinet mission and the last chance for unity. In the spring of 1946, 3 British men arrived in India carrying what was, whether they fully understood it or not, one of the heaviest briefs in modern diplomatic history. Lord Pethick Lawrence, the Secretary of State for India, was elderly, earnest, and genuinely sympathetic to Indian aspirations in a way that his predecessors in that office had rarely been. Sir Stafford Cripps, the President of the Board of Trade, was sharp, cerebral, and had previous experience with India, having led an earlier failed mission in 1942, whose failure still rankled. A.V. Alexander, the First Lord of the Admiralty, rounded out the trio with a naval administrator's preference for things that worked as designed. Together they constituted the cabinet mission, and they had come to figure out how to hand over a subcontinent without it falling apart in the process. No pressure whatsoever. The political context that sent them was significant. The Labour government under Clement Attlee had won the British general election of July 1945 in one of the most dramatic electoral upsets of the 20th century, sweeping Winston Churchill and the Conservatives out of power with a majority that surprised almost everyone, including Labour. Attlee was a quiet, undemonstrative man who was frequently underestimated and was therefore frequently successful. He was also genuinely and substantively committed to Indian independence in a way that went beyond political calculation. This was not a government looking for ways to delay. The mission was not a stalling tactic dressed up as diplomacy. It was a serious attempt by serious people to find an arrangement that could actually work. That it ultimately failed tells us more about the depth of the problem than about the sincerity of the attempt. The problem, stated simply, was this. The Congress and the Muslim League had arrived at positions that appeared, on the surface at least, to be mutually exclusive. The Congress wanted a strong central government for a united India, a federal structure in which the centre held real power over defence, foreign policy, finance, and the major sinews of national life. The Muslim League wanted Pakistan, a separate sovereign state for the Muslim-majority regions of the subcontinent, and Jinnah had made clear that this was not a negotiating position he was preparing to abandon cheaply. The cabinet mission was trying to find something in the space between these two poles, something that neither side had asked for but that both might be persuaded to accept. This is the kind of diplomatic task that looks impossible from the outside and feels impossible from the inside, and occasionally, just occasionally, works anyway. This was not one of those occasions, though it came closer than most people remember. The Cabinet Mission Plan, announced in May of 1946, was a genuinely ingenious piece of constitutional architecture. And I use the word genuinely with some deliberateness, because ingenuity in this context is not a compliment I hand out lightly. The plan proposed a three-tier structure designed to give each side something substantial, without giving either side everything. At the base of the structure would sit the provinces, each with full autonomy over all subjects except those specifically assigned to higher bodies. These provinces would then be organised into three groupings. Section A would contain the Hindu majority provinces of central and southern India. Section B would group together the Muslim majority provinces of the northwest, Punjab, Sindh, Baluchistan, and the northwest frontier province. Section C would group Bengal and Assam in the northeast, also Muslim majority in terms of the regional balance. Above the groups would sit a central union, lean and limited, dealing only with defence, foreign affairs and communications. Everything else would sit with the provinces and the groups. The plan explicitly rejected a fully separate Pakistan, and the reasoning it offered for this rejection was not merely political, but practical and demographic. A clean territorial division of the subcontinent along religious lines was, the mission argued, simply unworkable. Dividing Punjab and Bengal, the two provinces that sat astride any conceivable boundary, would leave enormous Muslim minorities on the Indian side and enormous Hindu and Sikh minorities on the Pakistani side. The problem of minorities would not be solved by partition. It would merely be relocated, with the additional complication that the relocated minorities would now be citizens of a foreign state, rather than a minority within their own country. This was a serious argument. Whether it was persuasive to those who needed to be persuaded is another matter entirely. Here is where the story becomes complicated in the specific way that this entire period is complicated, which is to say, everyone was simultaneously right about something important and wrong about something equally important, and the combination proved fatal. Both the Congress and the Muslim League initially accepted the Cabinet Mission Plan, accepted it, signed on, agreed to proceed. This is worth pausing over, because it is so easy in retrospect to read the entire trajectory of events as pointing inevitably toward partition, and the initial acceptance of the Cabinet Mission Plan is a reminder that it was not inevitable, at least not at this moment. There was a window, however narrow, in which both major parties had said yes to the same thing. The League accepted the plan because Jinnah and his colleagues read the grouping system as providing the constitutional scaffolding from which Pakistan could eventually be constructed. If the Muslim-majority provinces were grouped together with their own executive and legislature, and if those groups had genuine autonomy, then the practical reality of separation would exist even within the formal framework of unity. The League was accepting a transitional arrangement that it believed pointed in the direction it wanted to go. The Congress accepted the plan with considerably less enthusiasm and with an interpretation that was, from almost the first moment, subtly but significantly different from the League's. Almost immediately after accepting, Congress voices began to suggest that the grouping of provinces was not actually mandatory, that individual provinces retained the right to opt out of their assigned group, that the compulsory element of the grouping system was not as compulsory as it appeared. This interpretation, if correct, would have allowed Hindu-majority areas within the Muslim-majority group provinces to detach themselves, which would have gutted the plan's ability to deliver anything the League had agreed to it in expectation of receiving. Whether the Congress was deliberately undermining the plan from the outset or was genuinely reading the text differently is a question historians continue to debate. The charitable interpretation is that these were honest differences in legal reading. The less charitable interpretation is that the Congress accepted the plan publicly while planning to dismantle its operative mechanism privately. The truth is probably somewhere between, and the somewhere between probably varied from individual Congress leader to individual Congress leader. Then came the press conference. In July of 1946, Jawaharlal Nehru, who had just been elected President of the Congress, held a press conference and said, with the directness that was one of his most admirable and occasionally most catastrophic qualities, that the Congress was not bound by anything except its decision to enter the Constituent Assembly, and that the Congress remained free to modify the scheme once inside that assembly. The Muslim League's reading of this statement was not unreasonable. Nehru was announcing that the Congress considered itself free to reshape the constitutional framework that both parties had just agreed to, once it was in a position to do so. Jinnah withdrew the League's acceptance of the Cabinet Mission Plan. The plan collapsed. The last serious attempt to find a constitutional arrangement for a united India was over. This moment has generated more retrospective anguish among historians than almost any other single event in the partition story. Had Nehru not made that statement, had Jinnah been willing to read it more generously, had the British been firmer in insisting that both parties honour their stated commitments, had the Congress been more imaginative about what genuine accommodation of Muslim League concerns might require, any of these changes might, some argue, have produced a different outcome. Others argue with equal conviction that the structural incompatibilities between the two parties' positions were simply too deep, that the Cabinet Mission Plan was a brilliant solution to a problem that was not actually solvable by constitutional cleverness, and that the collapse was inevitable even if the particular moment of collapse could have been delayed. History, maddening as always, does not run the alternative timeline that would settle this argument. We are left with what happened, and what happened was the plan collapsed. What came next was significantly worse than a collapsed plan. The Muslim League, frustrated and convinced that the path of constitutional negotiation had been closed to them by Congress' bad faith, called for Direct Action Day on August 16, 1946. Jinnah framed it as a demonstration of Muslim determination to achieve Pakistan through direct action, rather than through the constitutional methods that had, in his view, been rendered futile. In Calcutta, which was governed by a League-controlled provincial ministry under H.S. Suhrawardy, the day produced catastrophic communal violence on a scale the subcontinent's cities had not seen before. Exactly who struck first, and in what sequence is disputed by historians and was disputed at the time. What is not disputed is what the 4 days that followed produced. Somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people killed in Calcutta, Hindus and Muslims killing each other in the streets of one of the subcontinent's great cities, in scenes of savagery that shocked observers who thought they had already seen enough to be unshockable. The violence refused to be contained. It spread to Bihar, where Hindu mobs attacked Muslim communities with devastating and largely unprovoked ferocity, killing in numbers that some estimates place in the thousands. It spread to Noakhali in eastern Bengal, where Muslim mobs attacked Hindu communities, burning homes, killing, abducting women, forcing conversions. The cycle of communal retaliation was feeding itself, each atrocity providing the justification for the next. Gandhi responded in the way that was most characteristically his own. He walked. He was 77 years old, frail, increasingly deaf, and he walked through the villages of Noakhali on bare feet, staying wherever someone would take him in, speaking to whoever would listen, trying to demonstrate by sheer physical presence that a human being could choose peace even in the middle of violence. He stayed for months. Whatever your assessment of Gandhi's politics, whatever the debates about his strategy and his limitations, the image of that old man walking through the ruins of communal violence in the winter of 1946 is one of the most morally serious images of the entire partition story. He knew the political situation had moved beyond what he could control. He walked anyway. Sometimes that is all there is left to do. Mountbatten, the deadline, and the decision. In February of 1947, Prime Minister Clement Attlee stood up in the House of Commons and made 2 announcements that, taken together, changed the trajectory of the subcontinent more decisively than anything that had happened in the previous decade of negotiation, argumentation, and political manoeuvring. The first announcement was that Britain would leave India by June 1948 at the latest. A firm deadline. Not a vague aspiration, not a conditional promise, not the kind of carefully hedged commitment that could be quietly extended when circumstances proved inconvenient. A date. The second announcement was the name of the man being sent to make it happen. Lord Louis Mountbatten, who would serve as the last Viceroy of India. These 2 announcements need to be understood together, because each one shaped the meaning of the other. The deadline without the man would have been an empty gesture, since previous British commitments on India had demonstrated an impressive capacity to dissolve under pressure. The man without the deadline would have been another viceroy presiding over another round of talks that produced another report that went into another drawer. Together they represented something genuinely new. A British government that had decided, with apparent finality, that it was actually leaving, and had chosen the person it trusted to close the door behind it. Lord Louis Mountbatten was, by any reasonable standard of assessment, a remarkable human being. And I use that phrase with the full awareness that remarkable can mean several different things simultaneously. He was a member of the royal family, great-grandson of Queen Victoria, cousin of the reigning King George VI, which gave him a social and symbolic standing that no purely political appointment could have conferred. He had commanded Allied forces in Southeast Asia during the war, which gave him genuine military credibility and experience of large-scale operational complexity. He was charming in the specific way that certain people of sense, privilege and natural charisma are charming, which is to say comprehensively and somewhat alarmingly, the kind of charm that fills a room before the person has finished walking into it. He was energetic in ways that exhausted the people around him, and he was possessed of a confidence in his own judgment and abilities that was, to put it as diplomatically as possible, very healthy indeed. Less diplomatically, the man's ego could have used its own separate office. He was also, and this was the detail that mattered most practically, given powers that previous viceroys had not possessed. He could make decisions that would normally have required referral back to London, and the lengthy process of cabinet consultation that such referral involved. He had been sent, in effect, with authority to act. Previous viceroys had been administrators managing an ongoing situation. Mountbatten had been sent to close down an empire, and he had been given the tools to do it without having to ask permission at every step. Whether this was the right approach to a situation of this complexity, whether more consultation and more time would have produced better outcomes, is one of the central questions in the historiography of partition. What it meant in practice was that when Mountbatten decided something, it happened, and it happened quickly. He arrived in India in late March of 1947 and began meeting with the principal figures of Indian politics with a speed and intensity that impressed observers on all sides. He met with Nehru, he met with Jinnah, he met with Gandhi, he met with Vallabhbhai Patel, the Congress's organisational strongman, who was in many ways the most practically powerful figure in Indian politics, and who is sometimes overlooked in accounts that focus on the more dramatically compelling personalities of Nehru and Gandhi. He met with provincial governors, military commanders, civil servants. He was, by all accounts, an extraordinary listener in one-on-one settings, whatever his other qualities, and he processed what he heard with considerable speed. What he concluded, within weeks of his arrival, was something that the cabinet mission had spent months trying to avoid concluding. Partition was inevitable. The communal violence of the previous year, the scale and savagery of the Calcutta killings, the spread of violence to Bihar and Noakhali, the sense that the subcontinent was balanced on the edge of something that could become a general civil war, the irreconcilable interpretive gap between what the Congress and the League understood themselves to have agreed to, all of it pointed in the same direction. Mountbatten became convinced, and fairly quickly, that a united India was not achievable. Not in the time frame available, not with the political forces as they actually were, not given the human realities on the ground. He began working toward what he concluded was the only viable alternative, the most rapid possible transfer of power to two separate dominions. Now, there are things to admire about Mountbatten's conduct of this brief, and the things to find genuinely troubling, and historical fairness requires acknowledging both, rather than collapsing into either uncritical celebration or wholesale condemnation. On the admirable side, he moved. He cut through the layers of qualification and postponement that had characterized British Indian policy for years. He made decisions. He brought to the situation a decisiveness that the circumstances arguably required. He was also personally courageous in ways that went beyond the professional, willing to put himself in positions of genuine risk in the service of what he believed needed to happen. On the troubling side, he developed a close personal relationship with Nehru that was warm, easy, and intimate in ways that his relationship with Jinnah was not, and perhaps could not be. Jinnah was not a man who warmed to people easily or quickly, or perhaps at all. He was formal, precise, somewhat cold in his personal manner, and constitutionally incapable of the kind of charm offensive that Mountbatten deployed so naturally. Mountbatten, for his part, found Jinnah difficult in ways he found Nehru easy, and the differential in personal chemistry almost certainly influenced, in ways that are impossible to fully quantify, the differential in how much latitude each leader was given as negotiations proceeded. Pakistani historians have raised this point with considerable persistence and with some justification. The personal is never entirely separable from the political, and the personal dynamics of these relationships mattered. There is also the question of Edwina. Lady Mountbatten developed during this period a relationship with Nehru that was intimate and profound, and whose precise nature has been the subject of speculation and debate since more or less the moment it became visible to observers at the time. Letters between them survive and have been published, and they are letters of extraordinary closeness and tenderness. Whether the relationship was romantic in a physical sense has never been definitively established, and probably never will be. What is clear is that it was a relationship of genuine emotional depth between two people of exceptional intelligence and personal quality, and that it existed in the middle of one of the most consequential political negotiations of the 20th century. Historians treat this with varying degrees of seriousness, ranging from those who consider it essentially irrelevant to the political outcomes, to those who wonder whether Mountbatten's notable sympathy for the Congress position owed something to his wife's closeness to the Congress's leading figure. I am not in a position to resolve this debate. I mention it because it happened and because pretending it did not happen in the interest of keeping the history clean would be its own kind of distortion. The Mountbatten Plan, announced on June 3, 1947, set the date for the transfer of power. Not June of 1948 as Attlee had originally announced. Not even the end of 1947, which would have been a dramatic acceleration in itself. August 15th, 1947, 10 weeks from the announcement. The reason Mountbatten gave for the acceleration, and there is no particular reason to doubt that this was his genuine assessment, was that the political situation was deteriorating with such speed, violence was spreading with such momentum, that a longer transition period would not produce a calmer handover, but a more chaotic one. Every additional month in his reading was a month in which more people would die and more institutions would collapse, and the possibility of an orderly transfer would recede further. Whether this judgment was correct is one of the most actively contested questions in the entire partition literature, and it is contested not as an academic exercise, but because the answer matters for how we understand what followed. Critics have argued, with considerable force and with evidence, that the speed of the transition was itself a primary driver of the violence that accompanied it. 10 weeks was not enough time to move millions of people safely. It was not enough time to establish the administrative and security arrangements that might have reduced the killing. It was not enough time to communicate clearly to communities along the border what was about to happen to them and what resources would be available to help them. The compressed timeline did not cause the violence in any simple sense, but it created conditions in which violence on the scale that occurred became vastly more likely. Whether a slower transition would have been calmer, or simply more drawn out in its catastrophe, is the question that divides historians, and it is a genuine question without a clean answer. What is not debated, because it is simply a matter of record, is the extraordinary nature of what the timeline required. Independence for India and Pakistan was announced on June 3, 1947. The date of independence was August 15th, 1947, and on the day that announcement was made, the border between the two new nations had not yet been drawn. The line that would determine which villages, which families, which farmers' fields, which irrigation canals, which centuries-old communities would belong to which country had not been determined. That task had been assigned to a man named Cyril Radcliffe, who had arrived in India for the first time in his life in early July, who had never seen the Punjab or Bengal, who spoke no Indian language, and who had been given 5 weeks to complete it. 5 weeks to draw a line through the middle of a civilization. What could possibly go wrong? Drawing the line, Cyril Radcliffe and the border. Cyril Radcliffe was a distinguished British lawyer, the head of Lincoln's Inn, and someone who had, before June 1947, absolutely no experience with India, its geography, its demographics, or its history. He was appointed chairman of the boundary commissions for both Punjab and Bengal, the two provinces that were to be divided between India and Pakistan. He arrived in India on July 8, 1947. He was given 5 weeks to draw two borders. He would later say that he did not enjoy his time in India and could not regret leaving. This is, under the circumstances, perhaps one of the greatest understatements in recorded history. The task was, to put it diplomatically, complicated. The boundary commission in each province consisted of 4 Indian judges, 2 nominated by the Congress and 2 by the Muslim League, with Radcliffe as the tie-breaking chairman. The 4 judges disagreed on virtually everything, meaning that in practice Radcliffe made almost all the substantive decisions himself. He was working from maps, census data, and submissions from interested parties. He was working in a climate of brutal heat. He was working under extraordinary time pressure, and he was drawing lines that would determine which communities in which villages would be citizens of which country. The Punjab division was the more complex, and in its consequences the more devastating of the two. The Punjab was a province of the Indus and its tributaries, a land of extraordinary agricultural fertility, with a population deeply intermixed between Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs. There was no clean line that could be drawn. Wherever the border went, substantial populations of each community would find themselves on what they considered the wrong side. The Sikh community was particularly affected. Sikhism's holiest sites, its historical heartland, the land of the 10 gurus, was concentrated in the central Punjab. The border divided the Sikh community between India and Pakistan in a way that was, from the Sikh perspective, existential. There was significant advocacy from Sikh leaders for a separate Sikh state, Khalistan, but this option was not seriously pursued by the British or the Congress. The specific decisions Radcliffe made about the border produced intense controversy. The Gurdaspur district is perhaps the most discussed. Gurdaspur had a Muslim majority overall, which would logically place it in Pakistan, but Radcliffe awarded it to India. The reason, or at least the suspected reason, is that without Gurdaspur, India would have had no road access to Kashmir, the princely state whose future was already looking uncertain. If this logic shaped the Gurdaspur decision, as many historians believe it did, then the border in Punjab was influenced by considerations about Kashmir that had nothing to do with the demographic logic the Commission was supposed to follow. Radcliffe completed his award and submitted his reports to Mountbatten before Independence Day. But Mountbatten chose not to release the awards until after the independence celebrations were over. August 15th came and went. Both nations celebrated their independence, and the populations in Punjab and Bengal did not know where the border was. The awards were released on August 17th. The people living in those border regions found out then which country they were now citizens of. Radcliffe received a fee of 40,000 rupees for his work. He refused to keep the money. He burned his papers relating to the commission. He rarely spoke publicly about his experience, and when he did, he expressed what seemed like genuine distress about the consequences of his decisions. He was not a villain. He was a competent lawyer put in an impossible situation and given insufficient time, insufficient resources, and insufficient guidance. The villain, if one is looking for a narrative villain, is probably the decision to attempt a division of this complexity in this time frame, or perhaps the villain is the entire preceding century and a half of colonial governance. History, as usual, resists simple casting. The announcement and the first days of freedom, August 14th, 1947, Karachi. The city is hot and alive with a feeling that has no precise name in any language. The feeling of a people standing at the threshold of something they have wanted so long and so badly that the actual arrival of it produces a kind of disorientation alongside the joy. Pakistan comes into being at midnight. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the man who had wanted this into existence through sheer force of legal intelligence and political will and a determination that his opponents had consistently underestimated, now holds the title of Governor-General of the new nation. He is also, though almost nobody outside his immediate circle knows this, dying. The tuberculosis that has been consuming him for years has advanced to the point where his doctors are privately astonished that he is still upright and functioning. He's upright and functioning because he has decided to be, which tells you something essential about the kind of man he was. Jinnah addresses his constituent assembly, and the speech he gives surprises people. It surprises them because it is secular. It surprises them because it is pluralist. He tells the assembly that Hindus and Muslims would now be free to go to their temples and their mosques, free to practice their faiths without interference from the state, free to be citizens of Pakistan without the state having any business with their religion. He says that in the course of time, Hindus would cease to be Hindus and Muslims would cease to be Muslims, not in any religious sense, but in the sense that before the state they would simply be citizens, equal citizens, of one nation. It is a vision of Pakistan as a homeland for Muslims that would be governed on secular democratic principles, a state created in the name of religious identity that would then, having been created, set that identity aside as a basis for governance. The speech sits, and has always sat, in a state of considerable tension with the two-nation theory that was the intellectual foundation of Pakistan's existence. If Muslims and Hindus are two separate nations with incompatible destinies requiring separate political homes, as the theory holds, then a secular state in which religious identity is officially irrelevant is a somewhat puzzling outcome. If the point was simply to have a state where Muslims would not be a permanent political minority subject to Hindu majority governance, then a secular democratic state in a Muslim majority territory achieves that without needing to go near theocracy. Jinnah seems, in this speech, to have been articulating the second vision rather than the first. What Pakistan actually became, the ongoing and unresolved argument within Pakistani society about whether the country is an Islamic state or a Muslim-majority secular state or something in between, is a debate that flows directly from the ambiguity Jinnah either deliberately embedded in the founding moment or failed to adequately clarify. Pakistani scholars and citizens are still having this argument. It is one of the most important arguments in contemporary South Asian politics. It began, in some sense, with the speech Jinnah gave on the night his country was born, August 15th, 1947, Delhi, India. The hour is midnight, which in the Hindu and astrological tradition is an auspicious time for beginnings, a detail that Nehru was probably too secular to have chosen deliberately, but that resonated deeply with the crowd regardless of his intentions. The Constituent Assembly has been in session since 11 o'clock in the evening, building toward the moment when the clock strikes 12 and the transfer of power becomes legally complete. Jawaharlal Nehru rises to speak, and what he says becomes one of the most celebrated passages in 20th century political oratory, not because it is rhetorically flashy in the way that some great speeches are, but because it captures, with genuine elegance and feeling, the weight of what the moment actually means. He speaks of a tryst with destiny. He speaks of a pledge made long ago that is now being redeemed, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. He speaks of the moment when the soul of a nation long suppressed finds utterance, when the years of striving and sacrifice give way to the fact of freedom. The speech is beautiful in the specific way that Nehru's prose was beautiful, which is to say it has bone structure beneath the eloquence. It is not merely decorative but genuinely thoughtful, and it carries within it an awareness of everything that has not been achieved alongside the acknowledgement of what has. He was always, beneath the statesman's composure, a man who understood tragedy. The speech knows this is not a simple triumph. In the streets outside, it does not matter. The crowds that have gathered regardless of the late hour are not in the mood for complexity. There is joy of a kind that is genuinely difficult to imagine from the outside, the joy of a people who have spent not years but generations being told, in 100 explicit and implicit ways, that they are not capable of governing themselves, discovering at the stroke of midnight that they can, that they will, that they are. The fireworks and the shouting and the weeping in the streets of Delhi on the night of August 15th are among the most entirely understandable human reactions in the historical record. Whatever came before and whatever would come after, this moment was real, and it was earned, and the people celebrating it in the streets had every right to celebrate. And at the same time, right at the same time, the same hours, the same night, something else was happening. In the Punjab, the province that Cyril Radcliffe had spent 5 weeks dividing into Indian and Pakistani halves, violence was spreading through villages and along roads and in the crowded cars of railway trains. In Bengal, the eastern half of which was now East Pakistan and the western half of which was now the Indian state of West Bengal, communities were already beginning to move in fear, and the fear was not without foundation. The joy of Independence Day and the terror of the partition violence did not happen in sequence, one finishing before the other began. They happened simultaneously, in the same country, in the same hours, in some cases within the same city. This is the fact about partition that resists the narrative structures we instinctively reach for, because we want the independence celebrations and the catastrophe to be separate chapters, and they were not. They were the same chapter, happening in different places at the same time. Gandhi was not in Delhi. He had not come to the capital for Independence Day. He was in Calcutta, and he was fasting, and he was not celebrating. He called it, with a directness that must have been painful to hear for those who had worked alongside him for decades, a day of mourning. This requires a moment of attention, because it is one of the most powerful and heartbreaking images the entire partition story produces. The man who had done more than almost any other individual to make Indian independence possible, who had organised the mass movement that made British rule untenable, who had spent decades in prison and on hunger strikes and walking through villages trying to build the free India he believed in, was sitting alone in Calcutta on the night India was born, fasting and grieving. Not because independence was wrong, but because the independence that had arrived was not the independence he had worked for. The line through the middle of the country, the communal violence, the abandonment of the vision of a united subcontinent where Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs and everyone else lived together as citizens of one nation, was for Gandhi a defeat that the political achievement could not redeem. In London, the newspapers marked Indian independence with the mixture of reactions you might expect from a country processing the loss of something it had called the jewel in its crown for the better part of 2 centuries. There was pride, expressed in language about Britain having fulfilled its civilizing mission by preparing India for self-governance, which requires a certain relationship with irony to read without wincing. There was genuine regret among those who had loved India in the complicated way that people who exercise power over a place can love it. And there was, one strongly suspects, a considerable amount of relief that the whole extraordinarily complex, expensive and morally fraught business was now, at long last, someone else's problem. Cyril Radcliffe had declined dinner with Mountbatten the night before Independence Day. He was already on his way out of India, boarding a plane back to England with what can only be described as purposeful haste. He did not wish, it seems, to celebrate an event that he understood better than most could not be celebrated without also mourning. The border awards, the lines he had drawn through Punjab and Bengal, were sitting in sealed envelopes. They would be released to the public on August 17th. On Independence Day itself, the populations living along the border did not yet know which country they were citizens of. This is not a small detail. It is an almost incomprehensible one. The new governments of India and Pakistan faced, in their first days of existence, a task of complexity that would have challenged institutions with decades of experience and did not slightly less than destroy institutions that had existed for a matter of hours. The Indian Army, which had been a single unified force, had to be divided regiment by regiment, battalion by battalion, soldier by soldier. The Indian civil service, the administrative backbone of the entire subcontinent, had to be divided with Muslim officers opting for Pakistan and Hindu, and Sikh officers remaining with India, a process accompanied by personal anguish, rushed decisions, and the sudden disappearance from offices of colleagues who had worked side by side for years. The Reserve Bank, the currency reserves, the national debt, the physical stock of currency notes, all had to be divided according to an agreed formula that immediately became the subject of ferocious dispute, with Pakistan alleging, with some justification, that India was slow-walking the financial settlement in ways that amounted to economic strangulation of a newborn state. The railways had to be divided. The irrigation canals, many of which crossed what was now an international border, had to be assigned and their management negotiated between 2 states that were already barely on speaking terms. The post offices, the telegraph lines, the meteorological stations, the archaeological survey offices, the forest departments, all the administrative sinews of a modern state that had functioned as one organism, had to be cut apart and reconnected as 2 separate organisms in a matter of weeks. And then there were the princely states. Over 500 of them, each with its own treaty relationship with the British Crown, each now in the position of needing to accede to one or the other of the new dominions since the Crown's departure had dissolved those treaties. Most of them did so without serious incident, a fact that deserves acknowledgement since it is often overlooked in accounts that focus, understandably, on the dramatic exceptions. 2 of them did not. One was Hyderabad, a large Muslim-ruled state with a Hindu majority population in the south of the subcontinent, whose Nizam hoped to maintain independence. The other was Kashmir. Both would become crises. Kashmir would become a crisis that has not ended. The Great Migration, humanity on the move, and then the people began to move. The scale of what happened in August and September of 1947 in the Punjab is almost beyond the capacity of ordinary language to convey. Historians estimate that somewhere between 10 and 20 million people crossed the border between India and Pakistan in the weeks and months following independence, the largest forced migration of human beings in recorded history. To put that number in some kind of context, the population of Australia is currently around 26 million. Imagine the entire population of Australia uprooted from its land in a few months. That is approximately what happened in the Punjab. The movement was not, at first, entirely forced. Some people, particularly in areas close to the border, had already begun to move before August 15th, sensing what was coming. After the border announcement, the movement became a flood. Muslims from the Indian side of Punjab moved toward Pakistan. Hindus and Sikhs from the Pakistani side moved toward India. They moved in enormous columns, on foot, in bullock carts, by train, in trucks. The columns stretched for miles. Some columns contained 100,000 people. The road from Lahore to Amritsar, once a short and unremarkable journey, became one of the defining images of the century. An endless river of humanity moving in both directions simultaneously, each flow passing the other on the road. People carried what they could. A woman who left Lahore carried her jewellery sewn into the hem of her salwar. A farmer who left his village in Montgomery district carried his one good plough tool. A shopkeeper carried his account books. Children carried nothing, or were carried themselves. The elderly sometimes could not walk and were carried on the backs of younger family members, or were sometimes left behind, which is a sentence I write with the full weight of what it means. Sometimes the choice was impossible. Sometimes the choice was made for them by the violence that was following the columns. The trains were a particular horror. The railways were the arteries of Punjab, connecting Lahore to Amritsar to Delhi, connecting the villages of the Central Plains to the cities of both new nations. The trains became targets. Trains carrying Muslim refugees from India to Pakistan were stopped by Sikh and Hindu mobs, and the passengers massacred. Trains carrying Hindu and Sikh refugees from Pakistan to India were stopped by Muslim mobs, and the passengers massacred. The trains arrived at their destinations with no living passengers, entire trainloads of dead. The words that kept appearing in contemporary accounts are trains of blood, ghost trains. The station masters who received these trains faced the task of telegraphing their superiors with messages that no station master had ever trained to send. The specific mechanisms of the refugee crisis varied between the Punjab and Bengal. In Bengal, the partition was accompanied by violence, but the migration was slower and more extended over years rather than concentrated in a few weeks. This is sometimes described as a better outcome, and in terms of immediate death tolls it may have been. But it also meant that the crisis was less visible, less concentrated, and in some ways more corrosive, a slow bleeding rather than a hemorrhage. In the Punjab, the concentrated catastrophe of a few months produced administrative conditions of almost total breakdown. The governments of both new nations were simultaneously trying to manage the movement of millions of refugees, while also building the institutions of states from scratch. The Punjab Boundary Force, a combined military formation established to keep order in the border zone, had 12,000 men to manage an area containing something like 4 million people in violent movement. It was inadequate. The force's commanding officers knew it was inadequate. There was nothing to be done about it. There were not 12,000 more men available. Relief camps sprang up on both sides of the border. These were not camps in any comfortable modern sense. They were fields in which people arrived with nothing, were given whatever could be organised in the circumstances, and waited. The monsoon was falling. Disease spread. Cholera. Smallpox. People who had survived the violence of the crossing died in the camps from illness and exposure. Children were separated from families in the chaos, and in some cases were not reunited for years or ever. Among the stories that are told about the refugee columns is one that I find particularly haunting, and I want to be honest that this story, like many from Partition, lives in the space between documented history and community memory, where exact verification becomes difficult. It is the story of Wells. In the chaos of the migration, some families, particularly Sikh families on the Pakistani side of the border, chose to throw their daughters into wells rather than allow them to be abducted by mobs. The women sometimes chose this themselves, sometimes were given no choice. There is a well in a village near Rawalpindi associated with this story that has become a site of pilgrimage and memory for some Sikh communities. The historical record confirms that abduction and sexual violence against women was a systematic feature of the partition violence, and that some families took this specific terrible action to avoid it. How many? In which places? With what degree of volition? These questions do not have complete answers. The violence, what words cannot fully hold. I want to pause here for a moment, because this chapter is about something that resists narration, and I think it is worth acknowledging that before we continue. The violence of partition has been estimated to have killed between 200,000 and 2 million people. Depending on the methodology used and the geographic scope considered, the most commonly cited figure is somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million dead. These are catastrophic numbers. They sit in the same order of magnitude as the Holocaust, though over a much shorter period and in ways that are structurally different. And like the Holocaust, the numbers conceal more than they reveal, because behind every number is a person, and behind every person is everything they were and everyone who loved them. The violence was not random or spontaneous in any simple sense. It had patterns, perpetrators, specific forms. In the Punjab, it was heavily gendered. Women were particular targets, not because women were perceived as threats, but because attacking the women of another community was a form of asserting dominance over that community. Abductions ran into the tens of thousands. After independence, both governments established official programs to recover abducted women, and the stories of these recovery operations are themselves deeply morally complex. Women who had been abducted, converted, married, and had children were sometimes forcibly returned to families they no longer knew, separated from children they had borne, in the name of restoring their original identity. The women themselves were not always consulted. There were specific actors of extreme violence, irregular armed groups, some affiliated with the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, an organization of Hindu nationalist ideology that operated in India, carried out attacks on Muslim communities. Similar groups with Sikh identities carried out attacks in the central Punjab. Armed Muslim gangs carried out attacks on Hindu and Sikh communities. Former military men, demobilized after the war, brought their weapons home and sometimes used them. There were also ordinary men who would under different circumstances have lived ordinary lives, who became perpetrators of extraordinary violence in the context of communal collapse. The mechanisms by which ordinary people become perpetrators of mass violence are among the most important and most terrible subjects of 20th century social science. Not everyone became a perpetrator. This needs to be said, because the tendency to describe communal violence as if it swept up all members of a community is false and does injustice to the many people who resisted. There are documented stories across the Punjab of Muslims hiding Sikh and Hindu neighbours, and of Sikhs and Hindus hiding Muslim neighbours at significant personal risk. There are stories of Sikh truck drivers who drove their Muslim neighbours to safety rather than abandoning them. There are stories of Muslim households that sheltered Hindu families through weeks of surrounding violence. These acts of decency were not the majority. If they had been, the death toll would have been lower. But they happened, and they matter. The nature of the violence was intimate in ways that make it particularly difficult to process. This was not primarily bombing from the air or artillery fired across a distance. This was violence committed by people who in many cases knew their victims. The neighbour who sheltered you could also be the neighbour who attacked you. Decades later, survivors of partition often speak of this intimate betrayal as one of the most psychologically lasting aspects of the experience. The discovery that the fabric of community life, the assumption that the person next door was your neighbour, could dissolve in a matter of hours. The violence also produced a specific geography of atrocity that is still carried in the memory of communities on both sides of the border. Specific villages where massacres took place. Specific roads where columns were attacked. Specific train stations where bodies were recovered. This geography is memorialised differently in different communities. In India, there are some memorials to partition violence, though fewer than the scale of the tragedy might warrant. In Pakistan, the framing tends to emphasise the violence suffered by Muslims at the hands of Sikhs and Hindus rather than violence committed by Muslims against others. In Sikh communities around the world, the memory of the partition period sits alongside the memory of the Punjab as a homeland from which they were driven, a wound that has not healed in 3 generations. Gandhi was in Delhi by the time the worst of the Delhi violence erupted. He fasted as he had fasted in Calcutta, and as he had fasted before on multiple occasions when he believed that was the right response. The fast that he undertook in January 1948 was specifically directed at the Indian government's refusal to release to Pakistan the cash payment to which Pakistan was entitled under the division agreement. Gandhi argued that this was unjust, and that India could not begin its life as an independent nation by breaking its commitments. He also fasted against the violence in Delhi. The fast ended when the government agreed to release the payment, and when leaders of Delhi's Hindu and Muslim communities made commitments to protect each other. On January 30th, 1948, Gandhi was walking to his prayer meeting at Birla House in Delhi when a young man named Nathuram Godse, a Hindu nationalist who despised Gandhi for what he saw as his excessive sympathy for Muslims and his responsibility for partition, stepped forward and shot him 3 times. Gandhi died with the name of God on his lips, according to those who were present. He was 78 years old. The assassination stunned India and the world. Nehru's radio address that night is among the most moving political speeches of the century. The light has gone out of our lives. In the immediate aftermath, the violence in Delhi stopped. The moral authority Gandhi had exercised in life was, in death, briefly more powerful still. Godse was tried, convicted, and hanged. His ideology did not die with him. Kashmir, the wound that would not close. If partition created a scar, Kashmir is the place where the scar became a permanent wound, infected and never fully healed. Kashmir is also, in its own right, one of the most beautiful places on earth. A valley of extraordinary loveliness surrounded by mountains that has inspired poets and painters for centuries. The Mughal Emperor Jahangir reportedly said that if there is paradise on earth, it is here, it is here, it is here. He said it about Kashmir. It has also been one of the most heavily militarized zones on the planet for over 70 years. The Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir in 1947 was Hari Singh, a Hindu ruler of a state with a Muslim majority population. Under the partition arrangements, each princely state was supposed to accede to either India or Pakistan based on considerations of geography, contiguity, and the wishes of the ruler. Hari Singh, whose position was complicated by the fact that his own population was predominantly Muslim, and by his personal ambivalence about which way to go, initially sought an independent status for Kashmir. He signed standstill agreements with both India and Pakistan, keeping his options open while hoping the decision might somehow resolve itself. In October 1947, Pashtun tribal fighters from the Northwest Frontier Province, organised and in part equipped with support from Pakistani authorities, invaded Kashmir from the west. The exact degree of Pakistani official involvement in organising the tribal force is disputed. What is not disputed is that the invasion forced Hari Singh's hand. Facing the collapse of his state, he signed the Instrument of Accession to India on October 26, 1947. Indian troops were airlifted to Srinagar the following day. War between India and Pakistan began almost immediately. Indian forces pushed the tribal fighters and Pakistani irregular forces back from Srinagar, but could not dislodge them from the western and northern portions of the state. In January 1948, India referred the matter to the United Nations Security Council. The UN eventually arranged a ceasefire, which came into effect on January 1, 1949. The ceasefire line divided the state between Indian-administered Kashmir and Pakistani-administered Kashmir. The UN resolution called for a plebiscite to determine the wishes of the Kashmiri people. That plebiscite has never been held. The legal position of each side is detailed, and each side holds it with considerable conviction. India argues that the accession of Jammu and Kashmir was legal and final, that Pakistan's support for the tribal invasion was an act of aggression, and that the plebiscite is no longer applicable given subsequent developments. Pakistan argues that the accession was obtained under duress, that the Muslim majority population of Kashmir should have been part of Pakistan under the logic of partition, and that the unresolved plebiscite is an outstanding obligation of international law. Kashmiris themselves hold a range of views that are often suppressed, misrepresented or ignored in the Indian-Pakistani debate that tends to conduct itself as if Kashmiris were the terrain rather than the people. The conflict over Kashmir has produced 3 full wars between India and Pakistan, in 1947 to 48, 1965 and 1971, plus the Kargil conflict of 1999, which came uncomfortably close to the use of nuclear weapons by 2 states that both acquired nuclear capability in 1998. The nuclear dimension of the Kashmir dispute is something that those who live in the region live with in ways that those who live elsewhere often do not fully register. 2 nations, each with nuclear arsenals separated by a disputed border, with unresolved histories of tremendous mutual violence. This is the legacy of the decisions made in the summer of 1947. Within the Indian-administered Kashmir Valley, a long-running insurgency began in 1989. The Indian government's response to the insurgency has involved, according to human rights organisations including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, significant abuses including arbitrary detention, torture, enforced disappearances, and extrajudicial killings. The Pakistani government has supported the insurgency to varying degrees over the decades. Tens of thousands have died in the conflict. Hundreds of thousands of Kashmiri Pandits, the Hindu minority community of the valley, were driven from their homes in the early 1990s in circumstances that remain deeply contested and deeply traumatic. The valley has known virtually no peace in 3 generations. In August 2019, the Indian government under Prime Minister Narendra Modi revoked the special status of Jammu and Kashmir under Article 370 of the Indian Constitution and reorganised it into 2 union territories under direct central government control. The decision was welcomed by some as overdue administrative reform and condemned by others as a further suppression of Kashmiri self-determination. The situation as of the present day remains deeply unstable. The wound that began in October 1947 has not healed. The refugees and the rebuilding. After the calamity of the migration and the violence, after the trains of blood and the burning villages, after the millions of people who had crossed a border that had not existed 10 weeks before, there came the long and often unacknowledged work of rebuilding lives. On the Indian side of the Punjab border, the city of Amritsar became the initial point of arrival for hundreds of thousands of refugees from what was now Pakistani Punjab. The refugee camps that surrounded Amritsar and spread across the Indian Punjab were enormous, desperate, and profoundly inadequate. Food, water, shelter, and medicine were all in short supply. The new Indian government, only weeks old and still constructing its own administrative apparatus from scratch, faced a humanitarian crisis of staggering proportions simultaneously with the task of building a nation. The refugees came from specific places. They were not an abstraction. They were farmers from Montgomery and Multan and Lialpur, merchants from Lahore and Rawalpindi, teachers and lawyers and doctors from Sialkot, craftsmen from Gujranwala. They had had specific homes, specific streets, specific shops, specific fields. They had had relatives and friends and ancestors buried in specific cemeteries. They carried all of this with them as memory, even as the physical reality was left behind forever. The question of what to do with the refugees was not simply logistical. It was political and economic. The Indian government pursued a policy of rehabilitation that was, given the circumstances, genuinely ambitious. Land in the Indian Punjab was redistributed. Refugees who had left farms on the Pakistani side were given plots of comparable value on the Indian side. This sounds orderly, and it was, in retrospect, a significant administrative achievement. But it was also painful and contentious. The land given to refugees had often belonged to Muslims who had left it, creating a new layer of dispossession layered over the original dispossession. Property claims and counterclaims accumulated. Legal cases arising from partition property disputes were being heard by courts for decades. The city of Delhi was transformed by partition. The Muslim population of Delhi, which had formed a substantial portion of the city's cultural and commercial life, largely fled or was expelled in the violence of late 1947. Their place was taken by Hindu and Sikh refugees from West Punjab, who arrived in enormous numbers and settled in neighbourhoods, colonies, and eventually entire new extensions of the city. The Delhi that exists today, the culture of Punjabi food, the specific commercial character of areas like Karol Bagh and Lajpat Nagar is substantially a partition creation. The city was remade by the refugees. Lahore underwent the same transformation in reverse. The city that had been one of the great cosmopolitan centres of the subcontinent, a city of Hindu, Muslim and Sikh communities living in complicated and creative proximity, became overwhelmingly Muslim. The Hindu and Sikh populations, who had created much of the city's commercial and professional life, were replaced by Muslim refugees from Indian Punjab. The famous Anarkali Bazaar, the colonial-era buildings of the Mall Road, the ancient walled city with its mosques and temples and avelis, all of this remained physically, but the communities that had inhabited them changed utterly. Karachi, which became Pakistan's initial capital, expanded with extraordinary speed as Muslim refugees from across India flooded in. The Urdu-speaking refugees from the Indian heartland, known as muhajirs, meaning immigrants in Arabic, brought specific cultural and linguistic traditions to a city that had previously been predominantly Sindhi in character. The tensions between the Muhajir community and the indigenous Sindhi population of Karachi became one of the defining fault lines of Pakistani urban politics over subsequent decades, producing political movements, street violence, and an entire literature of displacement that continues to the present day. The psychological dimensions of the refugee experience are only now being fully studied and articulated. The first generation of partition refugees often did not speak about what they had experienced, or spoke of it only in fragments. There was shame, there was grief that had no adequate object, there was the practical necessity of getting on with life that made sustained mourning a luxury. The poet Amrita Pritam, one of the greatest Punjabi writers of the 20th century, wrote an elegy for partition addressed to the 18th century poet Waris Shah, asking him to rise from his grave and see what had happened to the language and land he had celebrated. The poem is one of the most affecting responses to partition in any language. The second generation heard stories in fragments, at the dinner table, in half sentences that trailed away. The third generation, which is now in its 50s and 60s, has often felt a profound need to recover what was lost, to know where the family came from, to visit the village or the city that was abandoned in a week in 1947. There are now organised tours to Pakistani Punjab for Indian Punjabis who want to visit the places their families came from. There are similar tours to Indian Punjab for Pakistani Punjabis. These journeys are often described by the people who take them as experiences of profound emotional complexity, grief, and recognition, and something that is not quite belonging but is something like it. Legacy, what partition made and what it broke. We have now arrived at the place where we try to make sense of everything we have walked through together. And I want to be honest that sense-making in the face of what happened in 1947 is a project that will never be entirely finished. History always exceeds the frameworks we build to contain it. What did partition make? It made two nations that have since become three, since the liberation of Bangladesh from Pakistan in 1971, in the course of a war accompanied by a genocide that killed somewhere between 300,000 and 3 million people, a range so wide it speaks to the impossibility of counting the dead as much as it speaks to genuine uncertainty. It made nuclear-armed rivals sharing a subcontinent. It made the longest-running territorial dispute in the history of the United Nations. It made enormous and vibrant diasporas in Britain, in North America, in the Gulf, communities shaped by the specific historical experience of partition, in ways that are still being worked through. India became the world's largest democracy, a fact that is genuinely remarkable and that should not be taken for granted. The democratic process has, with the exception of the emergency period of 1975 to 77, under Indira Gandhi, continued unbroken for more than 75 years. Indian democracy is imperfect, contentious, and sometimes alarming in its directions, but it is real. The Constitution of India, drafted under the leadership of B.R. Ambedkar, the great Dalit jurist and social reformer, is one of the most ambitious constitutional documents ever written, explicitly committing the state to equality, secularism, freedom of expression, and the eradication of caste discrimination. How well those commitments have been honoured is a question that generates vigorous and entirely appropriate debate within India. Pakistan's trajectory was more turbulent. The nation whose creation Jinnah envisioned as a safe home for Muslims, governed by democratic principles and the rule of law, struggled from the outset with the questions that partition had not answered. What kind of state was Pakistan? A Muslim homeland that would be governed by Islamic law? A democratic state that happened to have a Muslim majority population? A nation-state defined by its non-Indianness rather than by any positive principle? These tensions produced a series of military coups, starting in 1958 with Ayub Khan, followed by Yahya Khan in 1969, Zia-ul-Haq in 1977, and Pervez Musharraf in 1999. For roughly half of its existence, Pakistan has been governed by its military rather than by elected civilians. This is one of the most significant and most tragic aspects of the partition legacy. Jinnah himself died on September 11th, 1948, just over a year after the country he had created came into existence. He was 71 years old and had been ill with tuberculosis throughout the entire critical period of independence, a fact that was known to his inner circle but concealed from almost everyone else, including the British. The question of whether the knowledge of his terminal illness influenced his determination to achieve Pakistan as quickly as possible, his sense that he personally needed to be there for the birth of the nation he had created, is one that historians raise. It seems plausible. Jinnah knew he was dying. He had very little time. In retrospect, his entire political strategy in the final years had a quality of urgency that the terminal diagnosis could explain. Gandhi had been dead since January, killed by a Hindu nationalist who believed he had betrayed India. Nehru lived until 1964, presiding over the first and most idealistic phase of Indian democracy, the Nehruvian consensus of secular nationalism, non-alignment and planned economic development. The failure of that development model to transform the lives of India's poorest citizens quickly enough, and the challenges to the secular consensus from Hindu nationalism, are among the central themes of the India that came after. The question of whether partition was inevitable is one of those questions that feels extremely important and may ultimately be unanswerable. The argument that it was inevitable rests on the structural incompatibility between the Congress and League positions, the depth of communal tension after the violence of 1946, the mathematical problem of protecting Muslim minorities in a Hindu-majority democracy without structural guarantees that the Congress was unwilling to provide. The argument that it was not inevitable rests on the Cabinet Mission Plan as a possible middle way, on the demonstration that India and Pakistan could have shared defence and foreign policy while having considerable provincial autonomy, on the evidence that Jinnah's acceptance of the cabinet mission plan before Nehru's press conference represented a genuine moment of possible agreement. What is certain is that the specific form partition took, the compressed timeline, the inadequate preparation, the late announcement of the border, was not inevitable. The decision to divide within 10 weeks, whatever the arguments for speed, produced conditions under which violence on the scale that occurred became much more likely. This is not a retrospective judgment. It was said at the time, by people on all sides. The question of responsibility for partition, and for the violence it produced, has generated a literature of accusation and counter-accusation that has sometimes obscured more than it has clarified. The British are blamed for divide and rule policies, for the deliberate amplification of communal identity, for the speed and inadequacy of the handover. This is not without foundation. The Congress is blamed for inflexibility, for its refusal to genuinely accommodate Muslim League demands in the 1930s and 40s, for Nehru's press conference statement that undermined the cabinet mission plan. This is also not without foundation. Jinnah is blamed for insisting on Pakistan, for the Direct Action Day call that triggered the Calcutta killings, for preferring division to accommodation. This too is not without foundation, and all of those who committed violence are responsible for the violence they committed, regardless of the political context that surrounded it. But attribution of blame is not the same as understanding, and understanding is what the survivors of partition and their descendants need and deserve. In recent decades, there has been a significant movement to document and preserve the oral histories of partition survivors. The 1947 Partition Archive, founded by Gunita Singh Bhala, has collected tens of thousands of testimonies from survivors across India, Pakistan, and the diaspora. These testimonies are among the most important historical documents of the 21st century. They record experiences that would otherwise be lost when the generation that lived through 1947 passes away. Many of those people are now in their 80s and 90s. The window for their direct testimony is closing. The city of Amritsar, on the Indian side of the Punjab border, has a partition museum that opened in 2017. It is the first museum in the world dedicated specifically to partition. It contains personal objects, photographs, letters, and recorded testimonies. It is not a triumphalist space. It is a space of grief and memory, and an attempt at understanding. I mention it because its existence matters. The willingness to build a museum to an event that contains such profound national pain in a city that sits a 45-minute drive from the Pakistani border is itself a political act of considerable courage. On the Pakistani side, the acknowledgement of partition as trauma rather than solely as liberation has been slower. Pakistan's national narrative has tended to emphasize the achievement of independence and the violence suffered by Muslims during migration, rather than engaging with the violence committed by Muslims against Hindus and Sikhs, or with the suffering of communities on all sides. This is not unique to Pakistan. National narratives everywhere tend to remember their own suffering more clearly than the suffering they inflicted. But in the case of partition, the asymmetry has prevented the kind of honest historical reckoning that might contribute to reconciliation. The relationship between India and Pakistan since 1947 has been one of the most consequential and most troubled bilateral relationships in the world. They have fought 4 wars. They have engaged in continuous low-level hostility across the line of control in Kashmir. They have both acquired nuclear weapons, making their conflict one of the most dangerous on the planet. Trade between the two countries has been minimal. Travel has been restricted, and the normal traffic of cultural and human exchange that makes neighbours into neighbours has been largely blocked. And yet, the Punjabis on both sides of the border share a language, a food culture, a musical tradition, a sense of humour, and an agricultural heritage that no border has erased. When Indian and Pakistani citizens meet in third countries, in Britain or in Canada or in the United States, there is often an immediate and surprising warmth, a recognition of shared cultural vocabulary that crosses the political barrier. The novelist Bapsi Sidhwa, a Pakistani Parsi writer, and the novelist Amitav Ghosh, an Indian Bengali, have both written about partition in ways that honour the complexity of the shared heritage and the tragedy of the division. The shared musical tradition of the subcontinent, rooted in Hindustani classical music, has survived the border in both countries. Lata Mangeshkar and Noor Jahan, the 2 greatest female voices in the popular music of the subcontinent after partition, one Indian and one Pakistani, Both came from the same pre-partition musical world. The Wagar border crossing between Amritsar and Lahore has a daily ceremony at sunset in which Indian and Pakistani soldiers perform an elaborate and somewhat theatrical lowering of the flags, marching with exaggerated aggression toward each other before the gates close for the night. Crowds gather on both sides to watch, and the watching crowds tend to cheer, and there is in the cheering on each side a mixture of nationalism and something else, a recognition across the gate of a shared humanity that the political situation has made difficult to express in any other way. The ceremony is simultaneously absurd and deeply moving. It is also probably the most watched border ceremony in the world, which says something about the extraordinary hold that this particular border has on the imagination of the people who live near it. The 75th anniversary of partition, in 2022, was marked by commemorations, publications, documentary films, and a renewed wave of oral history collection. Prime Minister Modi of India and Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif of Pakistan, who had recently come to office, both made statements. Modi declared August 14th as Partition Horrors Remembrance Day in India. The relationship between the two governments remained, as it has for most of the past 7 decades, deeply strained. There is a question that survivors of partition often ask, or that their descendants ask on their behalf. Was it worth it? The question is almost impossible to answer. Worth it compared to what? Compared to a united India that might have descended into civil war? Compared to a federation that might have held? Compared to the continuation of colonial rule? The counterfactuals multiply and none of them are available. What is available is what happened, and what happened was both the birth of nations and the death of communities, both the achievement of long-sought independence and the destruction of a world that had taken centuries to build. The poet Sahir Ludhianvi, a Punjabi Muslim writer who had grown up in Ludhiana and fled to India after partition, where he spent the rest of his life and became one of the greatest lyricists of Hindi cinema, wrote with a bitterness and longing for his native Punjab that never left him. His hometown of Ludhiana was in India. His heart seemed to be in the Punjab that no longer existed as it had been. This is the experience of partition that the political histories cannot quite capture, the loss of a place that continued to physically exist but ceased to exist in the form in which it had been loved. The children of partition, the generation born in the 1940s and 50s who grew up in refugee homes in new countries, with parents who did not always talk about what had happened, have spent their lives navigating identities shaped by a trauma they did not personally experience, but that formed the ground beneath them. The grandchildren, now in their 30s and 40s in many cases, are the ones often most urgently engaged in recovery and documentation, as if the urgency increases in inverse proportion to the distance, as if the approaching loss of direct testimony makes the need to understand more pressing. There is a tree that I want to mention, and I mention it not because it is historically significant in a conventional sense, but because it seems to me to say something true about what partition means and what it has done. In the village of Kartarpur in Pakistan, just across the border from Dera Baba Nanak in India, there is a site associated with Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism, who is believed to have spent the last years of his life there. The site is sacred to Sikhs worldwide. For decades after partition, Sikh pilgrims could see the shrine across the border but could not visit it. In 2019, India and Pakistan together opened the Kartarpur Corridor, a visa-free passage allowing Sikh pilgrims to cross the border and visit the shrine. The opening of the corridor was one of the very few moments of genuine India-Pakistan cooperation in recent years. Pilgrims walked across a border that their grandparents had crossed in terror, and they went to pray at a place their families had been separated from for 70 years, and they wept. I mention this because weeping at a place you can finally visit seems to me to be a very precise description of what partition has cost, and what its continuation costs, and what the possibility of something different might feel like. Good evening, and if you're still with me, then thank you. We have travelled a long road tonight, from the valleys of the Indus to the smoking stations of the Punjab, from the courts of the Mughals to the midnight sessions of the Constituent Assembly, from the spinning wheel of Gandhi to the lawyer's files of Jinnah, from the border drawn by a man who had never seen the land to the trains that arrived at their destinations with no one left alive to disembark. This is one of the great stories of the 20th century. It is a story of colonialism and its consequences, of the ideas nations use to define themselves and the costs those definitions carry, of the gap between political achievement and human suffering, of the ways in which decisions made in rooms by a few people can determine the lives of millions who never sat in those rooms. It is also, in ways that are not always acknowledged, a story that is not over. The children and grandchildren of the people who crossed that border in August and September of 1947 are alive today. They live in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Britain and Canada and the United States and across the world. They carry the story in their DNA and their family photographs and their recipes and their dreams. The Partition of India is not history in the sense of something finished. It is history in the sense of something that continues to happen. But tonight, you have done something that matters. You have listened. You have given your attention to something difficult and important. You know more now than you did an hour or several hours ago about how a civilization was divided and what that division cost and what it continues to cost. Now slowly let the details begin to soften. Let the names and the dates drift toward the edges of awareness. What remains underneath all the specific history is something simpler. People wanted to be safe. People wanted to belong somewhere. People wanted to live their lives. Most of them, on all sides, were ordinary human beings trying to do ordinary things in circumstances that became extraordinarily violent and extraordinarily fast. Most of them would have preferred it to have gone differently. Most of them lived with the consequences for the rest of their lives. Let that land quietly. Let the weight of it settle without hurry. There is nothing to do with it tonight except hold it gently and let sleep come. The lights are dimming. The story is told. The rivers of Punjab still flow, as they always have, indifferent to the lines drawn across their plains, carrying water from the mountains to the sea, as they did before any of this happened and as they will long after its consequences are finally worked through. Sleep well.